"You want me to call your father?" She laughed when she said it. "Not the warm kind, the kind that fills a room with cold. Go ahead, call him. What is he going to do, drive here in that rusted pickup truck and save you?" Marcus said nothing. "Sign the papers," she said. "You can keep the truck." He didn't look at her. He was looking at the envelope she'd slid across the table. The one with the attorney's letterhead in the corner. The one with his name typed neatly above the word respondent. There was another name at the top of the page, just above hers. A name that didn't belong to anyone in the room. What Serena didn't know in that moment was that the envelope she'd pushed toward her husband had been prepared by a lawyer billing $400 an hour. And that the man she was dismissing, the man she'd spent 7 years calling ordinary, had just received a message from his father's chief of staff that the convoy was already moving. 300 vehicles. All of them stopping. For him. So, what does a man do when the woman who called him a failure watches 300 cars pull up outside? If this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, the kind where patience turns out to be the most devastating answer someone can give, then you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without it. Marcus Adeyemi was 34 years old, and he drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror that he'd patched with electrical tape. He lived in a 3-bedroom house in a mid-sized city called Caldwell, in a neighborhood where the houses all had the same faded shutters and the same narrow driveways. He worked as a logistics consultant for a regional freight company, a job he had deliberately chosen for its anonymity, for its reasonable hours, and for the fact that it required him to say very little about himself to anyone. He was good at his job. His colleagues liked him. His supervisor had offered him a senior position twice, and twice he'd turned it down, citing a preference for field work over management. That was partially true. The larger truth was that Marcus Adeyemi was not supposed to be working at a freight company at all. He was supposed to be in Lagos, managing the operational arm of Adeyemi Consolidated, the logistics and real estate conglomerate his father, Emmanuel Adeyemi, had built across 4 continents over the course of 41 years. Emmanuel Adeyemi was a man who moved differently in the world. He was not famous in the celebrity sense, but in certain industries, shipping, land development, infrastructure financing, his name carried the specific gravity of a man who has built things that will outlast him. He was worth, conservatively, somewhere north of $2 billion. He employed more than 600-800 people across Nigeria, the UK, the UAE, and the eastern United States. He owned homes in 4 countries and had once, at Marcus's request, agreed not to visit Caldwell without calling first. That request had been made 7 years ago, when Marcus was 27 and newly arrived in the United States with a plan he had never explained fully to anyone except his father. The plan was simple in structure. If not in execution, Marcus wanted to know what he was. Separate from what he'd been given. He'd grown up inside the architecture of his father's name, the private schools, the imported cars, the deference people showed before they knew anything about him personally. He'd graduated from a university in London and spent 2 years in the Lagos headquarters watching people treat him as an extension of his father's will rather than a person making his own judgments. He had found it suffocating. Not because he resented his father, he loved Emmanuel with a straightforward, uncomplicated love that the old man had earned. But because Marcus had never once been allowed to fail in any way that mattered. Every mistake had been cushioned. Every consequence had been softened. He didn't know what he actually was without the cushion. So he'd asked Emmanuel for 5 years of anonymity, no family name in professional spaces, no allowances, no visits to his address without notice. He would work, build something modest, and find out who he was when no one was watching. Emmanuel had agreed on one condition: he kept the compass. It was a brass maritime compass, about the size of a large man's fist, that had belonged to Marcus's grandfather, Joseph Adeyemi, who had worked as a harbor pilot in Lagos before Emmanuel had made the family's first serious money. The compass had a crack along the outer casing that Joseph had never repaired, saying a thing didn't need to be perfect to know where north was. Emmanuel had carried it when he was building the company. He'd handed it to Marcus the morning Marcus left for the United States, tucked inside a cloth pouch, without any speech or ceremony. Just pressed it into his hand and held his son's shoulder for a moment longer than usual. Marcus kept it in the top drawer of his bedside table under a parking stub and an expired library card. He hadn't moved it in 7 years. He met Serena Whitfield 9 months after arriving in Caldwell. She was working events coordination for a hotel downtown, good at her job, genuinely warm, with a laugh that arrived quickly and without apology. Their first 6 months together were uncomplicated and good. She was curious about him in the right way, interested in who he was rather than what he represented, and Marcus found himself relaxing in her company in a way he hadn't expected to relax anywhere in this country. They married after 2 years. It was a small ceremony, 22 people, a rented hall near the river. He called his father the morning after, and Emmanuel said he was glad. For the first 3 years of the marriage it held. Marcus worked, Serena worked. They built a life at the pace their income allowed, a used car replaced with a slightly less used car, a vacation taken every 18 months. Dinner at the good restaurant downtown on anniversaries. It was ordinary in the specific way Marcus had wanted his life to be ordinary. He was comfortable with it. He thought Serena was too. The shift when it began was too incremental to name while it was happening. It started with Serena's mother, Patricia Whitfield, who visited for the first time in year 3 of the marriage and spent 11 days in their house making observations she framed as helpfulness. Patricia was a woman who had strong opinions about the gap between where people were and where they ought to be, and she communicated those opinions in the measured, persistent tone of someone who has never been told to stop. She noted that Marcus's car was practically speaking embarrassing. She observed that the kitchen could stand to be updated, that the neighborhood was fine, meaning it was not. She made a point, more than once, of comparing Marcus favorably to no one, an absence that said more than any comparison would have. Marcus absorbed it with the kind of patience that reads, to certain people, as compliance. Serena absorbed it differently. In the months after Patricia's visit, small things began to change in Serena's posture toward their life. She started watching lifestyle content, renovation accounts, travel accounts, accounts that staged the daily lives of people with more money than time. She began mentioning with increasing frequency the things her coworker Brindle had done on her vacation, the things Brindle's husband managed to afford, the fact that Brindle never seemed to worry about the transmission in her car. Marcus noticed the pattern without flagging it. He thought it might pass. It didn't pass. Patricia returned the following summer and extended her 11-day visit to 23 days. And by the end of those 23 days she had said, in the direct but plausibly deniable way she specialized in, that Serena had deserved better choices in a husband. She said it while discussing a friend's daughter who had married a man in finance. She did not look at Marcus when she said it, which made it worse. Serena did not correct her. That was the thing Marcus held on to afterward, not what Patricia said, but that Serena had let it stand. The summer Patricia left for the second time, a man named Colton Fraser began appearing in the margins of Serena's social life. He was a friend of a colleague, then a contact, then someone Serena mentioned by name in conversation with increasing frequency. Marcus first encountered him at a gathering Serena had organized, a backyard dinner at a friend's house, nothing formal, 12 people, and a lot of wine. Colton arrived 40 minutes late in a car that made noise when it entered the neighborhood. A Maserati Levante in matte graphite that he parked at a 30-degree angle to the curb as though parallel parking were something other people worried about. He was 41, well-assembled, with the specific kind of ease that comes from never having had to earn a room's attention. It had always been given. He wore a watch Marcus recognized as a Patek Philippe Nautilus, the steel version, which sold for somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 on the secondary market and had an 18-month waiting list at authorized dealers. Colton wore it the way people wear things they've forgotten the cost of. He told a story at dinner about a weekend he'd recently spent on a friend's sailing yacht off the coast of Montenegro. He told it with the self-deprecating charm of a man who knows the story is impressive and wants to appear unaware of that fact. The table listened with the particular attention people give to someone who seems to represent a version of life they'd like access to. Serena listened the longest. On the drive home, she was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not comfortable quiet, but the quiet of someone sorting something. Marcus asked if she'd enjoyed the evening. She said she had. She said Colton seemed interesting. She said it without emphasis, without loading the word. He nodded and drove. 3 weeks later, Colton appeared again, this time at a rooftop event Serena had attended for work. She mentioned it in passing, the way people mention things they've decided don't require explanation. Marcus let it pass. 4 weeks after that, he found the messages. He hadn't been looking for them. He had borrowed Serena's phone to take a photograph because his own phone battery had died. And when he opened the camera, the last message thread on her screen was already visible, Colton's name at the top, a message sent 11 minutes before that read, "I keep thinking about what you said, that he doesn't see you the way you deserve to be seen." Marcus took the photograph. He set the phone down on the counter. He went into the kitchen and ran water over his hands for a moment, not because they needed washing, but because he needed 30 seconds to decide how to hold what he'd just read. He decided not to confront it yet. That decision would shape the next 6 weeks in ways he didn't fully anticipate. He was not passive by nature, but he had learned, growing up inside his father's world, that the most permanent damage is almost always done quietly, over time, without announcement. Emmanuel Adeyemi had a phrase for it. He called it choosing your ground, and what it meant in practice was that you never responded to provocation at the moment of provocation. You waited until the ground was yours. Marcus had watched his father apply this principle to board disputes, to regulatory challenges, to a hostile acquisition attempt in 2014 that had seemed insurmountable until Emmanuel spent 4 months preparing and then moved in a single week to dismantle it completely. Marcus started paying attention differently. He noticed that Colton's name appeared in Serena's calendar on dates she'd told Marcus she was working late. He noticed that Serena had begun charging certain dinners to a credit card he didn't have access to, a card she'd opened 8 months earlier that she'd said was for personal purchases she didn't want to involve their joint account. He noted the name of the bank, the approximate timing of her charges, and the restaurants that appeared on the statements he was able to see on a shared bank portal before she removed him from the access tier. That last detail, the removal from the access tier, was what moved Marcus from observation to documentation. He called Oliver Reed the following Tuesday morning. Oliver Reed was 49 years old and had been the Adeyemi family's attorney in the United States for 11 years. He had a firm in Washington, D.C. with 22 associates, and he billed at $600 an hour, and he was one of 7 people in Marcus's life who knew the full picture. Marcus had asked him, at the start of the Caldwell arrangement, to maintain his contact information under a generic business name in Marcus's phone, Reed Consulting, so that no call to or from his number would raise questions. "I need the full financial picture," Marcus told him. "Joint accounts, the card she opened in August, whether there's anything attached to my name I didn't authorize." Oliver didn't ask why. He said he'd have something in 4 days. What he returned with on the morning of the 5th day was more than Marcus had prepared for. Serena had, over the course of 9 months, transferred $61,400 from their joint savings account into a personal account he had no access to. The transfers had been made in increments between $3,000 and $8,000, never on a predictable schedule. Always labeled with descriptions like household repair or medical out-of-pocket, or once simply MISC. The personal account had been opened 7 months after Colton Fraser first appeared in her calendar. Oliver had also, without being asked, pulled the corporate registration records for a business entity called Fraser Meridian Holdings ELC, registered in Delaware 7 months prior. Serena Adeyemi, the name she'd used professionally after the marriage, for exactly this duration was listed as a secondary officer. Colton Fraser was the principal. Marcus sat with this for a long time at his kitchen table, the folder open in front of him. He did not feel what he expected to feel. He felt something with weight to it, something that sat in the chest and pressed. But it was not sharp. It was the kind of grief that comes from recognizing that something you'd suspected for months has simply stopped being a suspicion. He closed the folder. He called Oliver back. "I need to know if she's positioned to move assets," he said. "She's already started," Oliver said. "There are 2 property-related documents I want you to look at. She signed as a witness on a deed transfer last month. The property is in your name, Marcus." Marcus said nothing for a moment. "How much?" "The property was appraised at $340,000. The transfer was to a trust. The trust beneficiary is Fraser Meridian Holdings. The compass was in the drawer, 20 feet from where he was sitting." He thought about his grandfather, who'd navigated the Lagos harbor in the dark with equipment that cost almost nothing, and never missed. "All right," Marcus said. "We wait." Oliver paused. "How long?" "Long enough for her to think she's won." The next 6 weeks unfolded with the specific texture of a thing that is moving and appears still. Marcus went to work. He came home. He made dinner on the nights he made dinner. He said good morning. He did not change anything that would signal a change. Oliver worked in the background, pulling the legal threads with the patience of someone being paid to be thorough. He located the full financial scope of Fraser Meridian Holdings, a company that had, ostensibly, presented itself to Serena as a real estate investment vehicle with holdings in 3 southeastern markets. Oliver found 4 LLCs nested inside the primary structure. He found that Colton Fraser had incorporated similar entities in 2 other states in the past 6 years. He found that 2 of those entities had been dissolved after civil fraud proceedings. Proceedings that had been settled out of court, sealed, and that Colton had apparently not disclosed to any of the people he'd subsequently recruited as secondary officers. Serena had not known she was the third. Marcus held this information carefully. He did not hate her for it, not exactly. He felt something closer to the grief of recognizing that someone you loved had been made into a vehicle for someone else's plan, and that part of the mechanism was the way she'd been taught, over years of Patricia's visits and Colton's careful attention, to believe that Marcus was less than she deserved. The machinery of her own discontent had been used against her. He could see it clearly now. Seeing it clearly did not make it less damaging. Oliver made contact with a forensic accountant named Dr. Adeze Okafor, who had worked on 2 previous Adeyemi family matters. She spent 11 days tracing the $61,400 through 4 accounts, building a transaction history that could be presented in a courtroom in a format a judge could follow without financial expertise. She found that $22,000 of the transferred funds had already been moved into Fraser Meridian's operating account. She found that $14,000 of that $22,000 had been used to pay for a marketing presentation that Colton had apparently intended to use to recruit a 4th secondary officer. Marcus chose his ground. He chose it to be the annual dinner hosted by Serena's employer. The Caldwell Meridian Hotel, an event called the Founders Circle, held every October in the hotel's main ballroom, attended by roughly 240 people, the majority of whom worked in local business, hospitality, and city government. Serena had been coordinating this event for 3 consecutive years. She had told Marcus that Colton was attending as a guest of one of the hotel's corporate partners. Marcus confirmed he would attend. He had not attended the previous 2 years. He called his father the week before the event. Not to report exactly, Emmanuel didn't need reports. He had Oliver's weekly summaries and he read them without comment. Marcus called because he wanted to hear his father's voice. They spoke for 47 minutes about harbor engineering projects Emmanuel was financing in Calabar, about a dispute between 2 of the company's regional directors that Emmanuel had resolved by promoting neither of them and bringing in a 3rd candidate both had underestimated, and about the cracked brass compass that Marcus still kept in his top drawer. "Does it still know north?" Emmanuel asked. "Every time," Marcus said. "Then you have everything you need," his father said, and ended the call. 3 days before the Founders Circle dinner, Oliver called to say that he had secured from the court clerk's office, through a public records process that was tedious but unimpeachable, certified copies of both civil fraud proceedings from Colton's prior entities. He had also secured from a contact at the Delaware Secretary of State's office a certified copy of Fraser Meridian Holdings registration documents with Serena's name highlighted. Marcus asked him to have those documents available on the evening of October 14th. "At the hotel?" "At the hotel," Marcus said, "and tell my father the ground is ready." He did not explain what that meant. Oliver had worked for the Adeyemis long enough to understand that some instructions didn't require elaboration. The Founders Circle dinner began at 7 in the evening. The ballroom had been arranged with circular tables of 10, white linen, low floral arrangements that didn't block sight lines, and a stage at the north end where the hotel's chief executive would give a 20-minute address before dinner was served. Serena had organized the seating chart, the floral order, the lighting cues, and the menu. She'd been at the hotel since 9 that morning, and when Marcus arrived at 6:45, she was standing near the entrance in a burgundy dress, her hair arranged in a way that had taken time, talking to a man in a gray suit he didn't recognize. She saw Marcus cross the lobby and her expression moved through several registrations in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise. Then something closer to calculation. "You came," she said. "I said I would," Marcus said. She introduced him to the man in the gray suit whose name Marcus immediately forgot, and then excused herself to check something near the stage. Marcus found his table, table 11, near the back of the room, and sat down. Colton arrived at 7:12. A few minutes after the hotel executive had begun his address, he came through the side entrance with 2 other men, all 3 in dark suits, Colton's watch catching the ballroom light from across the room. He moved to a table near the center, table 4, Marcus noted, and settled in with the specific ease of a man who's decided he belongs wherever he lands. Patricia Whitfield was at table 6. She'd been invited by Serena, who had not mentioned to Marcus that her mother would be there. Patricia saw Marcus from across the room, and her expression registered the same cool assessment it always did. A brief appraisal. A verdict delivered through stillness. She turned back to her conversation. Dinner was served at 8. Marcus ate. He drank water. He watched Colton work the room between courses, standing, moving, pressing palms, deploying the specific charisma that had worked on approximately 3 previous women and had apparently worked again. He watched Serena watch Colton. He watched the way her attention tracked across the room when she thought no one was registering it. At 8:47, the hotel executive returned to the stage to recognize several employees for service milestones. Serena was recognized for her 3rd consecutive year coordinating the event. There was applause. She stood and smiled with genuine pleasure, and Marcus felt, underneath everything else, something that was not exactly sadness, but was related to it. At 9:04, Marcus's phone buzzed. The message was from Oliver Reed. 3 words, "They're here." Confirmed, at 9:09 the ballroom doors at the West End opened. Emmanuel Adeyemi walked in first, not because he'd been announced, but because the 2 men who preceded him, his security staff, had simply opened the doors and he had walked through them. He was 67 years old and carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who has been making large decisions for a long time and has stopped being nervous about them. He wore a dark suit and no tie, and he paused just inside the doors and found Marcus's table with his eyes in approximately 4 seconds. Behind him, through the open doors, the sound from the street carried faintly into the ballroom, the low rumble of engines, the muted rhythm of something large arriving and stopping. Someone near the west side windows looked out and said something to the person beside them. That person looked. Then the person beside them. The hotel executive, who had been preparing to conclude the evening, stepped back to the microphone out of instinct rather than intention. Colton Fraser had not yet registered what was happening. He was finishing a conversation with the man to his left, and his back was to the west entrance when Emmanuel walked in. Patricia Whitfield's expression shifted before she understood why. Emmanuel crossed the ballroom in the direction of Marcus's table without stopping at anyone else's. The room had not gone silent. It was more that it had contracted, the way air does before weather arrives, conversations thinning rather than stopping. He reached the table. He looked at his son. Marcus stood. Emmanuel put his hand on the back of Marcus's neck, the way he'd done since Marcus was a child, brief and firm, then released it. "You look well," Emmanuel said. "You came early," Marcus said. "I brought help." His father's expression was the one Marcus associated with endurance, not happy exactly, but grounded. Present, Serena had come around the edge of the room when she saw the entrance. She'd been moving toward the west doors when Emmanuel walked in, and she stopped now at a distance of about 14 feet, her event coordinator's instinct for disruption warring with something she couldn't immediately categorize. She knew who Emmanuel Adeyemi was. Every person in the logistics and freight world who'd been working long enough knew the name. She didn't yet know what he was doing in the ballroom or why he'd come directly to Marcus's table. It was Patricia who said it first, loudly enough to carry 2 tables in either direction, in the tone of a woman who has spent 30 years being the loudest person in any room she enters. "What is your father doing here?" The question was directed at Serena, not at Marcus. But it landed on the room. Marcus turned to look at his mother-in-law. He let a moment pass, long enough to let the question hang, not long enough for it to settle. "He came for dinner," Marcus said. "He does that sometimes." Patricia's face moved through confusion toward something that began to look like recalibration. Colton Fraser had turned. Finally, he was standing now, facing the room's west end. And his expression showed Marcus something he hadn't seen on Colton before. The specific look of a man recognizing a name he'd spent time researching and not expecting to encounter in this room on this evening. "Marcus," Serena said, not loudly but precisely. She'd moved closer. Her face was doing something complicated. "What is this?" Marcus looked at her. He felt something that was not contempt and not compassion but existed in the space between them. "This is my father," he said. "He wanted to be here when the papers were served." The word "served" made her go very still. Oliver Reed came through the east entrance at that moment, carrying a leather document case and accompanied by a woman Marcus recognized as Dr. Okafor, who'd dressed for an evening event with the matter-of-fact elegance of someone who'd attended courtroom proceedings in worse venues. Oliver moved to Marcus's table without hurrying. He set the document case down and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a task he'd rehearsed. He removed 3 sets of documents. The first was for Serena, the dissolution petition, the forensic account of the $61,400, and the certified fraud records from Colton Fraser's 2 prior entities. The second was for a process server who had entered behind Oliver and now crossed the room toward Colton Fraser's table. The third was a certified letter addressed to Fraser Meridian Holdings, ILC, documenting the fraudulent use of Marcus's property records in the unauthorized trust transfer. Colton received his papers without the Maserati entrances. His hands were on the table and he looked at the document on top, and then looked at the process server, and then looked across the room at Marcus. And what Marcus saw in his face was the specific expression of a man who had confused someone's patience for ignorance and had just discovered the difference. "You can keep the watch," Marcus said across the room, flat and without performance. "You're going to need to sell it." Serena was holding her documents without having opened them. Her face had moved past complicated into something that Marcus recognized as the beginning of understanding, not of this evening, but of the past 9 months, the sequence of small decisions, the name on the company registration, the sealed fraud records she hadn't known to ask about. "I didn't know," she said. She said it quietly, to Marcus specifically. "I know," he said, and he did. Outside, the convoy was still there. 300 vehicles, his father's staff and associates and the fleet that accompanied Emmanuel on certain trips, all stopped along the street that ran beside the Caldwell Meridian Hotel. A few guests had moved to the windows. A few were already on their phones. Patricia Whitfield said nothing. That was something Marcus noticed, and would remember. The legal dismantling of Colton Fraser's arrangements took 47 days from the night of the Founders Circle dinner to the date the last civil filing was accepted by the court clerk. Oliver Reed filed the fraudulent transfer action on the property deed within 72 hours of the event. The court issued a temporary restraining order on Fraser Meridian Holdings operating accounts within 8 days, freezing the $22,000 that had passed through from Serena's transfers while the full forensic review proceeded. Colton's attorney entered an appearance and immediately began negotiations, a sign, Oliver said, that Colton understood the exposure and had no interest in a proceeding where the sealed records from his prior entities would become part of the public record. Dr. Okafor submitted her forensic report on day 19. It was 43 pages long and traced every dollar through a transaction chain that left no ambiguity. The $61,400 was fully documented: origin, routing, use of funds, and the names attached to each account at each step. The report confirmed that $22,000 had been used for Fraser Meridian's operational costs. It confirmed that Serena had not received any of those funds back. She had been a vehicle, not a beneficiary. Colton settled on day 31. The terms included full restitution of the $22,000 to the joint marital account, dissolution of Fraser Meridian Holdings, a legal undertaking not to use Serena's name or the Adeyemi name in any future business filings, and a confidential payment to Marcus that Oliver described as significant without being specific. The 2 sealed records from the prior proceedings were referenced in the settlement as the mechanism that had produced Colton's willingness to resolve. On the morning of day 32, Colton Fraser's attorney sent Oliver a 1-line message confirming that his client had vacated his lease on the apartment in Caldwell's financial district. 3 weeks later, Someone at a shipping conference in Atlanta mentioned to a mutual contact that Colton had relocated to Phoenix. The Maserati, Marcus was later informed by a contact at the dealership, had been sold back to the dealer at a substantial loss 7 days after the settlement. The dissolution of Marcus and Serena's marriage was, by comparison, a quieter process. Marcus had not moved to punish Serena beyond recovering what was his. The $61,400, minus the $22,000 already recovered through Colton's settlement, was the subject of a separate civil proceeding that Oliver handled with the same methodical patience as everything else. But Marcus had already instructed him to structure any recovery in a way that did not leave Serena destitute. She had made decisions that cost her everything she'd been building toward, including the future she'd imagined. That was consequence enough. The divorce was finalized in December. Serena moved into an apartment on the east side of Caldwell. Patricia Whitfield, to Marcus's knowledge, did not visit. What remained once the legal architecture was dismantled and the parties dispersed was something simpler than Marcus had expected. He'd anticipated a residue of bitterness, the specific kind that accrues from prolonged patience and deliberate restraint. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something closer to the feeling he'd had when he first arrived in Caldwell 7 years earlier, a kind of deliberate exposure. A willingness to exist without cushioning and find out what remained. He returned to work the week after the settlement. His supervisor asked how he was doing, and Marcus said fine, and meant it in the specific way that isn't evasion but is precision. Fine meant upright, functional, moving forward. That was enough. Emmanuel called from Lagos on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the divorce was final. "I've been thinking," his father said, "about the harbor project in Calabar. The site lead position is open. You were going to say no when I offered it to you last year. I'm asking again. I'm still thinking about it," Marcus said. "That's different from no." "Yes," Marcus said. "It is." They spoke for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. A book Emmanuel was reading, a problem with a water feature in the garden of his Abuya house, the upcoming visit of his eldest grandchild from London. Emmanuel did not mention the convoy, or the hotel, or the night in Caldwell. He didn't need to. The thing had been done and the ground had held, and the rest was simply time moving forward. Before hanging up, Emmanuel said, "The compass." "Still in the drawer," Marcus said. "Take it out," his father said. "You know where north is now, you don't need to keep it hidden anymore." Marcus held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Then he went to the bedside table and opened the top drawer. Under the parking stub, under the expired library card, under the small ordinary debris of a life, lived quietly. The compass sat in its cloth pouch. He took it out. He set it on the table. In the low light of the bedroom, the cracked brass casing caught nothing. It didn't gleam, didn't perform. It simply held its weight and pointed north, the way it had always done, whether anyone was looking or not. There is a specific kind of man the world is very poor at reading. He doesn't announce himself. He doesn't perform his worth. He absorbs dismissal with the stillness of someone who knows something the room doesn't. And he waits, not because he's passive, not because he lacks the capacity for action, but because he understands that the most permanent things are built slowly and with intention. Every shortcut, every early confrontation, every moment of revenge taken before the ground is fully prepared, those produce satisfying noise and lasting nothing. He understood that. His father had shown him. What Serena lost was not Marcus's wealth. That would have found her eventually, or not, and either way it was beside the point. What she lost was the specific thing she'd spent years dismissing, the quality in Marcus that the money was at best a side note to, his patience, his judgment, his refusal to be moved by pressure that didn't deserve to move him. Those were not things she could recover by marrying better, or moving somewhere new, or being introduced to a different man at a different dinner. They were things she'd had, and failed to see, and forfeited. Colton Fraser lost something simpler, everything he'd built his scheme around. The access, the capital, the future officer he'd planned to recruit using Serena as credibility. What he hadn't calculated was that the man he'd used as a prop, the quiet, ordinary husband in the Ford pickup, was not a prop. He'd mistaken stillness for simplicity. It is a common mistake, and it has a high cost. The 412 employees of Adeyemi Consolidated's Eastern United States regional operations never knew any of this had happened. Marcus had made sure of that, explicitly and in writing, when he instructed Oliver on the terms of the settlement. Whatever became of Marcus's private life was not their exposure to Carrie. They had mortgages and school fees and parents and facilities and all the ordinary weight of ordinary living. They had not done anything wrong. They did not deserve to have their livelihoods caught in the crossfire of someone else's choices. Marcus named them specifically in the instruction, 412 people. And Oliver had confirmed after the settlement that none of the proceedings had generated any press coverage, any regulatory attention, or any disruption to the company's regional operations. That was the thing Marcus was most settled about. The compass is on his desk now. He's moved it from the drawer where it spent 7 years, from the hiding where it served its purpose. It sits in the open, cracked casing and all, pointing north the way things that know their purpose always do. If this story stayed with you, if something in it named a thing you've carried or recognized a patience you've been told to give up, then you're already doing the harder and more important work. The world will always have people who mistake your silence for limitation. Let them. The convoy moves when it's ready. If you want more stories like this, stories about people who waited, who chose their ground, who let patience do what anger never could, subscribe. We tell them every week, and they're all true where it matters. And if this one reminded you of something in your own life, say so in the comments. We read them.